everyone's time who is on time. So thank you for joining us for our first of a series of seminars on life in the floodplain. And we are hopeful that these will be helpful to all of you in educating you about tips, tricks, dangers, best practices. Even if you've lived here for 30 years, 40 years, or 2 years, we think that there will be some information tonight that will be helpful to you. So I am Caroline Thompson. I am Vice President of Yardley Borough Council. I would like to give a special shout out and thanks to my fellow council members, Councilwoman Kim Siegel-Morris and Councilman Matthew Curtin. I think they're both here. For helping plan this, as well as Manager Johnson and our Emergency Management Coordinator, Wes Foraker. And of course, a very warm welcome and heartfelt thanks to our professionals and our speakers tonight, Susan Mazzitelli, who's a certified floodplain manager, as well as Peter Toft, who is from Nottingham Insurance. So if you two won't mind just giving a brief professional introduction to yourselves, that would be awesome. Peter, would you go first?
Sure. I'm Peter Toft. I'm with Nottingham Insurance on North Main Street in Yardley. We also have an office in Hamilton Square, New Jersey. We have 40 employees, a little bit more right now, but we do business insurance. We can insure taverns, office buildings, contractors. But we also do a lot of personal insurance, which includes homeowners insurance, auto insurance, and flood insurance, and personal umbrellas and all that. So we are an independent agent whereby we represent various companies, including Chubb, Travelers, UFG, loads of carriers, MetLife, and we have choices. Our value proposition is that we have choices. Even now in flood insurance, as I'll explain later, there are choices too because of private market flood insurance. So that's our agency.
Thank you. Susan?
Hello, I'm Susan Mazzitelli. I actually live in Lower Mayfield Township and have for the past 21 years. So I'm, very familiar and love this area. I'm actually a consultant, flood mitigation consultant, and have been for over 15 years. I've worked in, a lot of municipal settings, government settings, and I specialize in flood mitigation consultancy. I work with Yardley Borough. I work with other municipalities in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. I consult on FEMA hazard mitigation, grant applications, project management, CRS, floodplain ordinances. So I kind of, round out everything with all the municipalities I work with, and Yardley's my favorite. So.
Good to hear. So Susan mentioned CRS. So Yardley Borough is part of a program called a community rating system where we are scored in a variety of categories, and we have earned through that program a 5% reduction on our flood insurance premium. So an added bonus of these sessions that we're holding is we're hopeful that through increasing education, which is a category in the CRS program, we might qualify for an additional percentage discount in that program. So thank you for attending and helping us reach for that goal. So this will be a very informal session. It's just a Q&A. We have some planned content at the beginning, and then there will be time at the end where you can ask pointed questions about your own experiences or issues that you're having. We do ask that you hold questions to the end if you can, but if you have a clarifying question that can't wait, that's totally fine. Am I missing anything? Any of my fellow co-hosts or planners? Did I cover everything? All right, so let's jump right in. We're going to start mainly with Peter talking about flood insurance. So not to go too quickly or too slowly, what is flood insurance? Who requires it? Does anyone ever walk into your office not knowing that they need it? Can you give a little background on kind of process getting flood insurance and who needs it?
The thing that triggers the need for flood insurance a lot of times is when people go to buy a home, and this happens all the time. And if they want to get a mortgage, the mortgage company does a due diligence check to see if for every property, to see if it's in a floodplain or not, whether it's, far out in the hills or whatever. So usually the mortgage company says, well, your property is in a floodplain, you're going to need flood insurance, which starts the process. And looking at your outline, yeah, that's exactly what it is. A mortgage company says you need flood insurance. Then the client, the person that is buying the home, of course, I'm going to talk about residential, they need a homeowner's insurance policy, which is a different policy, of course, and then a flood insurance policy to cover the property for flood. And then you name the mortgage company on that policy to protect their interest in it. That's the first common trigger of needing flood insurance. One thing I'll say is everybody, what they say in flood insurance is everybody is subject to flood, whether you're in a floodplain or not. Because I did find out one quick fact yesterday that 25% of flood claims in the United States are in non-floodplain areas. So everybody needs it. And I think about Rivergate, and half of those properties are, not half, a handful of them are in a floodplain, most of them are not. So if I lived there, I would get a flood policy.
So how do those of us who are in a certified floodplain, how is that determined? Like, it seems a little bit arbitrary sometimes. So if everyone's prone to flooding and I'm 3 houses up from me, they don't need a policy. How is that determined?
It's determined by the elevation of the property. What happens in flood insurance, FEMA and NFIP, which stands for National Flood Insurance Program, over time there's been developed what are called flood zones. The common one in Yardley Borough, east of the canal, is zone AE, which is definitely a floodplain. And those were determined by, here I have it in my notes, I first thought it was the Army Corps of Engineers, but it is not. It was determined by I can't find the entity, but there is markings that are all over the borough and various areas that mark the levels of these areas in the various floodplains. So if you're in Yardley Borough, east of the canal, most likely you have a zone AE and you need flood insurance.
So are there options when it comes to flood insurance? Does everyone in Yardley Borough have the same carrier? I know I've heard a little bit recently about private carriers that are cheaper. Can you talk a little bit about that?
For sure. The way it was up until, I'd say, 5-6 years ago, everybody had to get flood insurance through the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program, which was, the rate was set, and the rate was the rate. So if you had the same variables, say dwelling coverage and a deductible, the premium would be that. But what has happened in the past several years is, because there's insurance companies, private insurance companies have seen an opportunity to make some money on writing flood insurance. There is private market flood insurance companies. Our agency has 3 other private insurance flood companies that we use, and the premiums are all over the place, but typically they are lower. And I can refer to an agent down the shore, Long Beach Island, and he has 13 private flood insurance markets, but they're coming out of the woodwork, and there's loads of private market flood insurance companies. And typically you can find one of the 3 that has a lower rate than FEMA, NFIP.
So is it too good to be true? What's the give and take of getting cheaper coverage?
Well, there is no really, when it comes to coverage and a claim, there is really no downfall, because those private insurance, private market flood insurance companies have the same policy forms, the same contracts, and they abide by the same loss settlement procedures. So there is no downfall to that. The problem, if any, would be once you leave the NFIP, you would lose some benefits if you really wanted to get back in NFIP, such as the worst case scenario would be they would want to rate your policy on a true risk rate, meaning using an elevation certificate. And if you have a basement in Yardley Borough or Lower Makefield, your elevation probably is not too good, and then the premium would be exorbitant. So that's the risk. But we haven't seen that problem happening at all. And there's probably some private market flood insurance company that would write the policy. So, and there is some grandfathering that occurs that has a better rate if you stay with NFIP, then want to get back in later, the premium is a little higher. From what I hear, I haven't seen anybody do it. I haven't had any clients leave, then come back. So I don't know. I haven't seen it firsthand.
What about that CRS discount, Susan? Maybe you know this. Is that available on any through any provider or just through FEMA insurance?
It's actually an automatic discount should be on both the NFIP policies and I thought the private policies. And Peter can confirm that or not, but it's an automatic on your policy. You look at it under all of the additions and you'll see it as a discount.
Honestly, Susan, I haven't seen none of the 3 private market companies that we use. They don't give any acknowledgement of the CRS discount, but the premium's still lower.
Yeah, they may not because it's really technically an NFIP program. So that's why the private companies may not give that additional discount.
I don't think they do.
Yeah, I don't think they do either.
So that's something to consider. At 5%, it might not matter, but if we get up to 10%, that might be something those of us on the phone who are looking at our options might want to look at before we switch from one to the other. What are the different levels of coverage and like contents insurance, et cetera, and what do you usually recommend to your clients?
Well, the way it works with the NFIP program offered, the national program, the maximum that you can get on a dwelling residential dwelling is $250,000. And on contents, the maximum is $100,000. And what we see typically in the NFIP, even the private market, people tend to take higher deductibles. 5,000 is very common. And you can get up to 10,000 with NFIP. If you want to get more coverage than offered with NFIP, and you want to stay with NFIP, you can get excess flood insurance through more like private market insurers. Now, private market insurance programs do offer higher limits, much higher limits. The ones that I'm used to, they can offer up to $1 million of dwelling coverage and $250,000 of contents. As far as what we recommend, I mean, we always like to recommend more, but what people are doing in flood insurance realistically is typically they want to cover their mortgage because they don't want another insurance bill. So they're covering their mortgage, and they'll get, if they have a $200,000 mortgage, they're probably getting a $200,000 policy with a $5,000 deductible. A lot of people don't get contents coverage. We do recommend it or make sure they know it's available, but a lot of people don't get contents or very low limit of contents.
So you talked a little bit about the deductibles, $5,000, $10,000. That's a lot of money. What is the average claim amount in this area?
I don't know about this area, but I did check nationally. The average flood insurance claim is $43,000. So I don't have it for Bucks or Yardley Borough. I don't have that definite, but 43.
Susan or Wes, do you happen to know from our past bigger flooding event what that might have looked like in terms of claims?
I mean, there are some homes that have sustained over $200,000 in one claim. There's a house on North Delaware Avenue, has over $750,000 in claims. And I think it was 3 or 4 claims. The average I see in a lot of these, properties that come to Wes and I are around what Peter said, like 50,000, 70,000. It kind of depends. The flats seem to be more average in that 40 to 50 to 60 over by Morgan Avenue, which is that Rivermar?
Rivermar.
Rivermar. Yeah, those are a lot higher and more frequent. So.
Okay, so we talked about shopping around a little bit. We have more options than we used to in terms of carriers. We talked about, living in a town that's in the CRS program. Are there any other ways that we who live in a floodplain can reduce our rates?
Yes, well, you can increase your deductible. And we talked about that already. And like I said, you can lower your coverage if you have contents coverage and you're not worried about a contents claim, or you can delete the contents or reduce it. You can reduce your dwelling coverage down to the mortgage amount if your mortgage company allows that, or you cannot cover it if you don't have a mortgage. One of the real expensive items that Susan is involved in, of course, you can elevate your home, which is very expensive. We know that. What some people have done, I haven't heard of anybody in Yardley Borough or surrounding areas that have done it, but I've talked to other agents, they fill in their basement. Once they fill in their basement, they don't have, because flood insurance is rated on the lowest floor level, which is the basement, the rate would improve for sure.
What does would improve mean? I mean, that sounds like a pretty substantial undertaking. Like, are we talking, what percent reduction?
Oh, I'm not really sure, Carolyn. I would guess, at least 25, 30%. I have no idea on that one, but because I haven't seen anyone do it or heard of anyone doing it. I've heard people talking about it, but the other thing you could do, if it's possible, let's say if you're on a cinder block foundation, you could, and you're up 2, 3, 4 cinder blocks, you could install flood vents. That it's feasible, and I don't know how costly it is to do that. I don't know the percentage, but that if you had flood vents, it would reduce your premium. I don't know the percentage. That's one thing. And the other thing to reduce your rate, just shop the insurance.
Okay, thank you. Another thing that I've heard could impact either way your rate is your flood elevation certificate. So when we moved into our house, we had a pretty recent one, and we were warned against getting an updated one because the rates could go up. Is that true? Or what's the process behind that? What are you required to do there?
Well, I think having a flood elevation certificate is a good idea to do, but that elevation certificate, even if you share it with your carrier, with your NFIP or other program, will not hurt you. They won't charge you more because your elevation is, say, worse than you're being rated for. They won't increase your rate. But it's interesting. I have run into this a couple times recently, that there are properties in Yardley Borough that are considered repetitive loss, whereby they've had, I forget what the criteria is to be considered repetitive loss, but that is designated by NFIP, and their rates are higher. But because repetitive rates are so high, even someone with a basement on South Delaware Avenue, that property, even though it was repetitive loss and the elevation was poor, the rates were so high in repetitive loss that the elevation certificate helped this property. So it's probably a good thing to have in your pocket, because you might need it eventually down the road if the flood insurance program says, okay, that's party's over, everybody needs an elevation certificate. So it'd probably be good to have it in hand. The unfortunate thing about getting one is the cost, and they run, I don't know if Susan knows, but I'm guessing it's a broad range. I'll say between $500 and $1,500 for an elevation certificate.
Yeah, there's a local company that I've been recommending who have been fantastic, and they run about, I think they're 500 for Yardley,
Okay.
which is the best rate I've gotten out of a lot of engineers, and they're very happy to come and have done many and many of them. So
Who's that, Susan?
it's Caldwell and Stout.
I've
And
never heard of that.
yeah, I'm more than happy. I can post it on the chat side if anybody's interested.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I can do that.
And so it sounds like what I'm hearing then is the folks that had an increased rate or decreased rate after they got their flood elevation certificate are probably people who didn't have one to begin with, not people who got updated ones. Because I spoke to a few people who their rates after they got their elevation certificate went up or down significantly.
Really, it shouldn't go up if depends on the age. There's other variables. It depends on the age of the home. If they're rated, not to get complicated, pre-firm, which is subsidized rates, their rate should not go up with say an unfavorable elevation certificate. I mean, all the homes that are being elevated, and Susan knows this, all the homes being elevated in Yardley Borough and Lower Makefield, they're getting elevation certificates because they need it to do the project, and it helps their flood insurance dramatically. Because these elevated homes are paying, it goes from say $3,000 down to $400 because they're elevated. They're out of harm's way now.
Okay, thank you. So we're gonna transition now over to Susan's section, but is there anything else you'd like to add? Any other tips or tricks on flood insurance before we do that?
I found out who set up those marketing. It was United States Geological Survey did those markings. I really don't have anything else other than it makes sense to try private market flood and see if it works out, and it's going to help your rate for sure.
Peter, if you are not in a flood zone, how do they think about the private companies, what the insurance rates are?
Okay, well, one thing I didn't mention, which I'm glad you said that, if you're not in a floodplain, you are eligible for the preferred risk program. And the preferred risk program has the same maximum, and that's an NFIP program, same maximums of 250,000 dwelling, 100,000 for contents with a $1,250 deductible. And those policies for that maximum coverage cost $572 per year. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but you can get that preferred risk program inexpensively if you're not in a floodplain or flood zone, and that is typically zone X.
Okay, thank you.
Peter, could you mention flood insurance for people who are renting?
I can count on my hand or my one finger how many people get like flood renter's insurance policy. People just don't get them. And I mean, we can do them. I have no idea what it costs for a renter's insurance. A lot of people don't get them because nobody's requiring them to get them. I'm sure it's probably $500 a year to get like $10,000, $20,000 of contents, but most people will not get them unless they're required to.
But it is
a good idea if you're along the river, that's for sure.
All right, great. Thank you, Pete. All right, so let's talk about Yardley Borough's floodplain specifically, shifting over to Susan. So what type of a floodplain are we, and how likely is it that we're going to experience a flooding event? Oh, you're on mute. I just unmuted you. There you go.
Yeah, I got it. Am I back on? Okay. So anyway, Yardley's floodplain is called a special flood hazard area, which is a term used by FEMA, and NFIP, which is a National Flood Insurance Program, which Peter was talking about. And it refers to the land area covered by the floodwaters or of the base or 100-year flood, which is an area of land that has approximately a 1% probability of flood occurring in any given year. So in these areas, the NFIP floodplain management regulations must be enforced. We have a floodplain ordinance in Yardley Borough. And the mandatory purchase of flood insurance applies to properties that have mortgages. So structures or homes in the special flood hazard area have a 26% chance of suffering flood damage over the normal 30-year life of a loan, according to FEMA. In the special flood hazard area, they are identified actually on flood insurance rate maps called firms. And you can actually Google, you can say, what is my flood zone? And you can enter your address. It's very easy to use. And you can look to see where your property lies in the floodplain. But most everyone who's on this call are in the floodplain and are probably in the AE zone, which is the highest risk flood zone to be in. So just kind of give you a background with the floodplain.
Thank you. So what are some tips you have about knowing when a flood is coming? I know, as the borough, we try to get information out there, but as an individual, how can I do my own research?
Well, actually, Wes is very, very important to this borough because he is the emergency management coordinator. And as soon as there's any forecast of a possible flood or heavy rains, Wes is on it immediately. And he is monitoring weather bulletins, and it's called the NOAA, which is what is that, Wes? The National
Oceanic Atmospheric Association.
To determine like if Yardley will meet its flood stage. And Yardley has a set flood stage, which is 21 feet. Is that right, Wes?
The flood stage is 20 feet. Our action stage is 18.5 feet.
Yeah, so, and the other part of that is I know Wes and everyone in the borough is using social media, the borough website, getting out as much information to the residents as possible about what is going on, keeping up to date. Wes, maybe you can also add to that of what else, what residents can do or what they're used to, when a flood comes.
Most folks who've been in the floodplain for some time have learned how to use what's known as the AHAPS gauge. It's the Weather Service's prediction for river stages. What Peter was referring to with the USGS, there are gauges throughout up and down the river that measure the height of the water. We monitor the Trenton gauge. That's our closest one. So you can dial into that yourself. You can look that up. It's public information, and you can see where things are going to go. The good thing, if there is a good thing about river flooding, is that we typically know about 48 to 32 hours in advance that we're going to be looking at some substantial water, so we can start to make plans.
And when the flood comes, everyone knows to start moving their stuff.
So one of our future sessions is going to be about, preparing and what you do when we get those alerts. So be on the lookout for those announcements. What are some of the things that Yardley Borough is doing to decrease our risk to residents of, either the threat of a flood or damage to our properties during a flood?
Well, Wes might be able to add to this a little bit more. I mean, I think the most important thing from my perspective, and, the borough has done an incredible job, and I'm just helping them to continue down this path, is, to be honest with you, is mitigating the properties, is being proactive instead of always being reactive. And, Yardley Borough has been very fortunate to be the recipient of a lot of FEMA flood hazard mitigation money. The borough any resident who's in the floodplain, can be eligible for a FEMA elevation grant. Usually, Yardley Borough's been working from the SRL properties down to the RL properties, and then you can down to the properties that are just in the floodplain. I think that first and foremost, that is one of the greatest programs in Yardley Borough. At one time, there were over 100 properties on the SRL and RL list, which are the homes that have been repetitively damaged. That list, I think, is down to fewer than 30 or 27 at this point. That's critical. Some of the things that homeowners can do, kind of piggybacking on what Peter said as well, one very easy thing is lifting your air conditioning unit up above base flood elevation. Once again, getting back to the importance of, if you can afford to go get an elevation certificate, it's a good idea. So you know where your house stands, where if the water's going to come in, where it's going to come in. If you lift your, air conditioning unit up, you can get a little bit of a discount on your flood insurance. If you can move your mechanicals, which are in your basement, somewhere else in your house, you could, put it in the attic if you have a spare little room. These are things that can at least mitigate some damage if there's a flood. And, and you can also see a little bit of a benefit on flood insurance and flood proofing in any way you can. Talk about flood vents if you're up a little bit, but those are some of the things that can be done if you don't choose to go the route of elevation, which is, can be very costly.
To kind of add on to that, to ask somewhat of a leading question, we have a pretty stringent floodplain ordinance that restricts what homeowners can do in the floodplain. Is that for any safety reasons, or why do we have that ordinance?
It is. And as I said to before, being in a special flood hazard area, the borough is required to have a floodplain ordinance. And the purpose of the floodplain ordinance, and people see it as being restrictive, it is for the purpose of keeping the community safe, for limiting the loss of life, limiting injury to people, limiting damage. It's really trying to protect the community and, prevent more damage from happening, and trying to, by not allowing new construction, by, having a fence ordinance, so that we can have certain fences so that when the flood comes, the flood doesn't, the fences don't, damage something else. It's really in the spirit of trying to keep everybody safe and, reduce loss of life, reduce damages.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about elevated homes. I think this is your comfort area for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Why are so many homes in Yardley Borough elevated? And you talked about this a little bit. What are the pros and cons? Why would somebody choose to do that?
Right. So I will get back to, there's two different categories. There is something called RL, which is repetitive loss, which Peter was talking about. And what would happen is, if you have an NFIP flood insurance, once you have 4 claims at $5,000 a piece, or 2 separate claims that total 25% of the market value of your structure, you will be designated automatically by NFIP as an RL property. Unfortunately, you would have higher flood insurance. Then you go to SRL, which is the most severe, which is flood damages on 2 occasions that exceed the market value of the structure. So basically, being in those 2 categories, which, as bad as they can be, therefore makes your property eligible for FEMA elevation money. So the borough, I think it's been since 2007, has, been involved in this program, and the residents have been very lucky, because the majority of these properties have been covered 100% by FEMA elevation grant money. And the program cannot be applied for by residents. It has to be done through the borough, and then the borough administers the program. So the most important thing is, these homes that have sustained, tens and tens, hundreds of thousands of damage, in order to keep these people safe, let them stay in their homes, keep the community intact, because we don't want to be acquiring homes. It really changes the demographics. It changes the look of the neighborhoods. We want everybody to be able to stay in their homes. So by elevating them, you've completely eliminated basically their flood claims, and you now keep them safe. They can stay in their homes. I think it brings more value to their homes. It reduces the emergency management needed to worry about getting these people in. Technically, they should leave, but they could stay. So that's the biggest program that the borough has actually embarked on. It's expensive, especially, but yeah, and then, there's people who are also RL who would have a 90% federal share, 10% share. But ultimately, if you elevate your home, you virtually eliminate your flood policy. FEMA requires it on a FEMA funded grant, but the flood policy drops to probably a few $100s a year. And it's suggested to keep it because there could be damage if something during a flood hit the foundation. So
just to clarify that, if you get your home elevated through grant funding, you have to keep some level of flood insurance. But if you elevate with your own money, not through a grant, you don't need to have flood
you
insurance
don't.
anymore.
But being on Peter's side, I would suggest it, because could you imagine somebody's oil tank come, barreling down the street, even though it's concrete block, there could be damage. And, if it's a few $100s a year and there could be $50,000 in damage, it's a good investment just to protect. You never know what debris could be coming.
Even if you're elevated, your mortgage company will still require you to have a flood insurance policy.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So can you talk a little bit, Susan, about the program, the grant program? How do you get involved in that if you're interested?
Sure. The borough, the last few years, was reaching out to homeowners on this SRL RL list, which is provided to the municipality by the NFIP. And we're very lucky because PEMA, which is the state agency of FEMA, has been really interested in mitigating a lot of these homes in Yardley Borough. They've partnered with Yardley and encouraging Yardley to say, listen, you have all these homes on this SRL RL list, reach out to the homeowners. We want to give them this opportunity. So Yardley used to hold more meetings. But like I was saying, there's been so many homes that have been mitigated. I think it's up to 57 homes that have been mitigated. So it's kind of come to the point now where residents are actually just reaching out to Paula or Wes and saying, listen, I've seen this house be elevated. Do you think I could be involved? Could I be part of the application? So we're kind of at that point now where it's actually starting to wind down, but it is always a possibility. The only caveat is, and this is a FEMA rule, if an application has to have at least one RL property, and then to carry a property which may not be RL, which is just any property in the floodplain. And I actually just submitted an application on behalf of the borough about a week ago for one property on Bell Avenue, which didn't meet RL. They just missed that definition with an RL property. So if it's approved, the person on Bell Avenue would have a 25% share. The other homeowner would have a 10%. But the homeowner on Bell said, you know what? We want to do renovations anyway. This is a great investment for us. 25% is a deal. So if we can do this, we'd like to do that. So it's kind of starting to go in that direction, which is a good thing, because the more homes you get elevated, the less damage and protecting people's properties.
And would somebody necessarily know if they were an RL property, like if they've just purchased the home? How do you find that out?
Well, actually, if they have to get flood insurance and they have a mortgage, it will be triggered by their flood insurance policy. So their agent would notify them, because their policy is different. It'll actually say RL on it. They would be notified of it. If they're not sure, they can always call Wes or myself. I can let them know if they're on the RL list or the SRL list. But most of those owners, I think, know at this point, unless homes change over. But yeah, we can always tell people if they're not sure. They're usually the ones with the highest flood policies.
On the insurance side of it, I typically will go into the company we use primarily for NFIP flood, which is Selective, and a repetitive loss property needs to be written through NFIP direct insurance, not Selective. And Selective will do a search on that property, and I'll get an alert. This is not eligible for Selective. It is because it's repetitive loss. So they tell me it's repetitive loss when I'm rating it up.
That's helpful. Thank you. All right, Susan, any other knowledge sharing related to the floodplain or elevations that you'd like to offer to folks?
Well, a couple interesting facts. There are over 323 homes in the special flood hazard area, and it's 125 acres of land in Yardley Borough for 1 square mile. That's a really big area. And what is very interesting, which we recently found out, since 1978, Yardley Borough property owners have filed more than $24 million in flood claims. And believe it or not, Yardley Borough is actually ranked very high in the country. Even despite all these floods down south, Yardley Borough has like some of the highest flood claims in the country. One other thing I did want to note about elevating is there is a program called increased cost of compliance, which is something that if you look on your flood insurance policy, it is a small amount that you pay every year as part of your premium. And you know, the ICC and NFIP is really trying to jumpstart this program again because people haven't been using it. And what it is, it basically, if you meet the requirement of SRL or RL, and the borough is actually adding this provision to its floodplain ordinance to now make money available to repetitive loss properties. And there are quite a few, especially in the flats. You could choose to elevate on your own and possibly be eligible for up to $30,000 towards the cost of the elevation if you meet the requirements of RL claims within a 10-year period. And it doesn't have to be recent. It could be from 2001 to 2011, as long as you're, you know, elevating your home. That's something people may want to consider if they were thinking about doing a renovation and they might be over that 50% threshold. It might encourage them to say, you know what, if I might be eligible for $30,000, you know, I'll do it. We've also been told by NFIP that they may be increasing that amount substantially, which 30,000 isn't enough. So I think they're coming to the realization that, you know what, maybe we can encourage people if we doubled it. So it's just an interesting thing that, you know, I actually was just able to recoup ICC money in another community for homes that were being elevated as well as homes that were being demolished. So.
Yeah, what does it cost to elevate your home? I mean, 30,000 doesn't seem like it would go very far, but every bit helps, certainly.
Yeah, it used to, unfortunately. I mean, in Yardley, in these projects, we have to use prevailing wage because it has to be bid out through the community. I mean, the average of the homes in Yardley Borough are running about $200,000. I do a lot of homes in New Jersey that are not prevailing wage or non-labor. They're significantly lower, like $125,000 to $150,000. A lot of contractors I know who they're like, if I'm at your house renovating your house anyway, if I'm going to do this, it's not going to be as much. So, you know, it's still a lot, but if you're paying $5,000 a year on a flood policy or $6,000, the return on investment, you know, you're not paying that policy anymore. So it's something to take into consideration.
Right. Okay, great. Any other thoughts, Peter, Susan, Wes, before we open it up to questions?
No, I don't think so.
No.
Okay, great. So if anyone in our audience has a question, now is your time. You can use the raise hand function if you'd like, or just unmute yourself and go ahead if it doesn't seem like anybody's speaking.
Hi, Tom.
Go ahead, Tom. I'll unmute you. There you go.
Got it. Yeah, I got it. So I live on Pennsylvania Avenue, and our Pennsylvania Avenue slopes from more or less north to south. So I'm a little bit higher than the people down at the other end, which is Letchworth. So I have a question. If you're in a neighborhood where a lot of houses have been elevated, but your house has not been elevated, then and you're in the floodplain, then it might be that your house is maybe worth less on the real estate market than the other ones because they're out of the floodplain because they're 12 feet in the air or whatever. And so if you elevate your home, it probably is it might be worth more. And I'm wondering if that has any impact on property taxes. If your property taxes might get risen because the value of your home has been increased because you got it out of the danger that it was already in.
I mean, it's interesting. Someone else posed this question to me. So I actually had to call Bucks County Board of Assessment about something else. And I just raised that question about 2 days to, you know, saying that would this increase the value? They were told me no. Even though it's a permitted thing, you're not, you're bringing the home into compliance with the floodplain ordinance. So technically, all of the homes in the floodplain are not in compliance, which is not a bad thing because elevating just protects them. So Bucks County Board of Assessment, they said no today. And I even wrote down this woman's name because that's a big concern a lot of people ask me. So I get that a lot in New Jersey because they're worried, but I was told because you're bringing your home into compliance, no. I don't know if anybody has a different answer. I was kind of surprised because I thought it would, and no one had asked that question before.
So you're not reassessed as new construction, you're still grandfathered to the original construction date, sounds like.
Yeah. Paula or Wes, have you guys heard anything about that?
Well, I think, you know, if you have an elevated house for sale right next door to a house that's not elevated that's for sale, people are going to wonder, you know, why I should look at this one versus that one. So I think it might be a harder sell if you're not elevated. But right now the market is so, it's hot right now in this area. Everybody's getting a top dollar. So I don't know that it's actually affecting things unless you put them side by side. And the good thing is we've been since 2011 since our last incident. So, you know, memory has a lot to do with it.
And I'm amazed. There are several homes since I've been, you know, with Yardley Borough on the SRL list that have, you know, changed hands and sold without being elevated. So I just think it's a great area to live in. And I think a lot of people see past that. So
I will say that I was able to sell in an unelevated home in Rivermar in 2005 with very little difficulty after it had been flooded several times.
I have a couple of other questions, Caroline. I don't want to take up too much time.
You can ask one more now and then we'll go to someone else and come back to you. How does that sound?
Okay. I do research into the impacts of climate change on pretty much every congressional district in the US that's on a coast. And I'm doing that because we're trying to promote a way of reducing the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere. But as a result of that, I've learned a lot about where do you look for information about flooding. And there's a wonderful foundation called First Street Foundation, and their website is firststreet.org. And they have done a study of flooding anywhere in the United States, not just the coasts, which I'm particularly interested in because of sea level rise, but anywhere. So if you go to their website and you type in your address, then you might be near a river, let's say in central Bucks County. So you're not going to be worried about river flooding. But you can find out what's the potential for flooding at your house. And also regarding what Susan just said about if you have a 30-year mortgage, you do have a 26% chance of getting a really devastating flood because you're here so long. So it seems like you have a 1% chance every year, which is true if you live in the 100-year floodplain. But actually, if you stay here long enough, you have a 26%. And I don't know how the math works for that, but that's one thing. So here's my question. We know that the climate is changing rapidly because we're putting so much pollution in the atmosphere. And we know that that what is happening is that we're getting bigger storms, more frequent storms. And when it rains or the wind blows, they tend to be much more intense. So my question is that factored in to FEMA's, ideas about the floodplain and the possibility of a flood. Their elevation studies to determine, the 100-year flood line is actually is looking backwards, as I understand it. It's a statistical model based on what has happened in the past. But that's not very good if the climate is changing and you're going to get much, much more rain in shorter time periods in the future, right? So that's my question. What's
It's very
FEMA doing
interesting that
about
you
the
said,
changing climate?
yeah, it's very interesting that you said that, because I was actually contacted about the Eastwick community in Philadelphia. I'm
Mhm.
actually very, very interested and very involved in the climate change and how climate change is really affecting flooding. And it's
Mhm.
like you said, it's not just coastal flooding, riverine flooding. It's very localized pockets of flooding. And doing these grant applications, the FEMA is encouraging more freeboard in these elevations, because
Mhm.
they know that climate change is just going to cause worse flooding. And FEMA is actually finally starting to look forward to how are we going to address these issues in the next 100 years. I mean, it's projected down by the Naval Yard that Philadelphia will be underwater.
It will
Completely
be.
underwater.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
these are things that are being addressed, and there's money has come out this year for the first time for a program called the BRIC program, which is now trying to address infrastructure to start to prevent the flooding to coming into communities. And it's more resilient community projects, not just elevating homes. It's dam projects, and I can't think of all the projects off my top of my head, but yes, going forward, we're hoping to benefit from upstream projects so that Yardley doesn't see the damage it has. It's going to take time, unfortunately, but it is being focused on a lot more, and I'm happy to see that happening, because you have to figure out how to have less flooding. I mean, you can elevate all you want, but the water is still going to come, and there's still going to be people who are going to be subjected to the flooding. So
Is that the reason why our rates are hiking more rapidly than they used to be? Is there any talks about getting rid of the grandfathering program with respect to flood insurance?
I haven't heard of it. I think the reason for the rate increase is the program is deep in the red. It's very unprofitable. And it's backed by federal money, and it's not a viable thing. And they need to increase the rates to try and get it better. And it's going to take a long time. So that's why they increase rates.
and
Probably
rates used to be
go
subsidized.
ahead. Go ahead, Susan. I didn't hear.
Flood insurance rates used to be subsidized. So what's happened now is, because of bigger waters, which I think was 2015, which was enacted, basically every flood insurance policy will keep increasing in the higher risk area to the actual risk of that zone that the homes are in. So unfortunately, Yardley Borough, there are a lot of these homes, which are SRL homes, that are seeing rates of over $9,000 a year. And we're going to get them elevated, but it's going to get bad, really bad for a lot of people.
So in my opinion, the most important thing we could possibly do to reduce our flood insurance rates in the next 30 years is to have national legislation which reduces the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere and moves us to a renewable energy economy. If we don't do that, then the warming of the atmosphere is going to cause these bigger and bigger storms and these more potential for damage. Just as an example.
Tom, I'm going to see if anyone else has questions.
Yeah, okay.
But thank you. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Amy, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much to all the speakers. Quick question. The monies that you're talking about that are available, are they only for full elevations of homes? So if you wanted to do some of that mitigation risk, such as, Carolyn, I think you mentioned, raising your air conditioner and changing the mechanicals and so forth, other things that can be done, are there monies for that or grants that can be applied for some of that, which would be less than obviously a full elevation?
Unfortunately, there is no grant money that I'm aware of for making those changes. I mean, I think we've had residents look into that before. So I'm not aware unless Wes, you are aware of anything?
I was under the impression you could use ICC for some of that, but I could be mistaken. But I want to point out one thing, Amy. I see that you're in the flats, and a lot of your neighbors probably have elevated, or some of your neighbors, and they've gotten garages. The flood maps were redrawn in 2015, so the required height is not what it was in 2007, 2009 timeframe. So now you would only be required to go up probably in the area of 4 to 5 feet. So you're not looking at going up 8 to 10 feet. It's much different. So just keep that in mind.
Hmm.
I know if you have kids, you have to carry everything in. That's why I chose to leave Rivermont. I was not going to carry everything up and down the stairs. It was a personal decision. It wasn't good for me. It is for everybody. But realize now that it's reduced for your neighborhood.
Okay, that's good information, Wes, and you're right. I mean, our front door is 3-4 steps up, and we don't have a garage. We actually live on the other end of from Tom. So I guess that's good news. I appreciate again, thank you to everybody.
Thank you for the question. Tom Metzler, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand a little bit more about the elevation certificate. What is it quantifying precisely?
So an elevation certificate is an engineer would come out and basically take measurements of your home and take the data from the FEMA firm maps, which these maps determine what the elevation is, your base flood elevation. Base flood elevation is basically how high the water would come technically in your house. So what it has on it, it talks about the map that applies to your home, when the map was adopted, what zone you are in. And in these measurements, it will say your base flood elevation. And if you want to go on the FEMA flood maps, you can probably approximate like where there's a squiggly line. It'll say like 43, 44, 45 as it runs along the river. So if your base flood elevation is 43 and you have a basement, and the basement is technically considered the lowest level, so you have to count that in. So if the base flood elevation is 43, the basement could be 31. And then your first floor, which would be your living floor, could be 38. So 43 minus 38 would be 5 feet. So your first floor is 5 feet below the base flood elevation. So there is a possible risk that if a flood came, the water would fill your basement and then fill up, a couple feet in the first floor of your home. So that's the data that captures. That basically determines your risk. And if you were to elevate, that gives an approximate, level of how high you would need to elevate your home.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Does the height of the elevation have any relevance in the cost of the elevation? If you only needed it to be a couple feet, would it be less of a project, or it's really just about lifting the house in general?
The elevation actually does relate to the cost of the house. I mean, it's not a huge cost, because the biggest cost is actually lifting the house and then building the new concrete foundation. I mean, I've had homeowners who, really only needed to go up 5 feet. And they said, I really would like a garage. So to add a couple more feet, it honestly was like under $10,000. And I don't even think it was that much. So it's not a huge cost. I'm not exactly sure, but that's from my experience, the difference in going a couple of feet just for concrete block.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I saw a raised hand from Tom Stocks. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, thanks again to the speakers for tonight. It's been very helpful, thanks. And as another Tom, I felt I had to ask a question. So Peter, this is probably for you mainly. In terms of insurance, we're relatively new to the area and I've had to do a lot of finding out about flood insurance. And for the last few years, we've got private insurance, which we found to be at least 5 times cheaper than the FEMA insurance. Does that sound right to you? You know, I'm just thinking of future years. If we can't get private insurance, should we plan for the worst?
From what I've seen, that doesn't sound right. That does sound too low.
Okay.
I haven't seen it 5 times as low. I mean, I'd be glad to look at it for you, but it probably is legit. But I've never heard that significant of a difference.
Okay. Yeah, and the other thing is that each year the private insurance keeps cancelling the policy, so we have to go and find a new one every year.
Why are they canceling?
They said they're pulling out of the market or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I have seen that a couple times. I'd be curious to see who they are.
Yeah, well, I might come by and quiz you on it.
Yeah, please do.
Next year. Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Yeah, Peter, your phone will be ringing off the hooks tomorrow with people wanting flood insurance. So
I'm going to put in a separate line.
Other questions?
Susan, is there a risk if somebody uses private flood insurance as opposed to NFIP? Unmute. Unmute, Susan.
Right.
I gotcha.
There you go.
I don't want to say it's a risk because
Okay.
I agree with Peter. I've heard of people having flood private and they're still being paid out their claims. The only thing is it can preclude a property owner for being eligible for a FEMA elevation grant. Because when you're with NFIP, your claims get put into a permanent database and FEMA and NFIP track those claims, which then will automatically trigger RL or SRL, which can make you eligible for 100% grant or a 90% grant. That's the only thing. You know, if you have a home that has never flooded or you're aware of it, I think you're kind of safe. If you're a home that's already had 4 claims, you might want to rethink it because that 5th claim, unfortunately, could be the claim that puts you over the top. And then they'll call you and say, Wes and Paula, could I be included in an elevation grant? And if you will miss out on it, that's the only thing with private.
Good point.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Okay, I don't see any. I'm going to ask Councilman Curtin to give a quick sell for his next session that he's going to be moderating.
Okay, well, thank you, Carolyn. And again, thank you, Susan and Pete. You guys did a great job, and everybody for participating. It's a benefit to the people who participate in terms of getting the content, but I think also all of us making an investment of time and coming to this and getting the information is beneficial to the entire community, as I think Carolyn alluded to around improving our CMS score. So thank you. The next session is going to be focused on buying and selling a home in the borough. So we're targeting 3 realtors, local people, right? Ideally people that live or work in the borough that have experience with selling and advising buyers in transactions in the borough to sort
in
of
the floodplain specifically.
In the floodplain, yes, yeah. Good, important clarification. Just to get do's and don'ts when you're selling your home, things to think about, things you have to disclose, things you can do to prepare, and then also when you're buying a home, really things you need to focus on and be thoughtful of. So we're going to target that for the first half of January, and we'll hope to get that information out within the next 2 weeks to give people plenty of time to prepare.
And also for people who might not even be thinking about moving right now, at some point, if you plan to move in 15 years, things that you could do to your house right now that are going to make it more valuable when you do want to sell down the road, because we don't want to see any of you go, just to clarify. Okay, well, yes, again, thank you, Susan and Peter, so much for your time, for your expertise, and thank you all for coming. This has been recorded, so we'll post it to our website if you want to rewatch it again and again. It will be available. Thank you all. Have a good
Thank
night.
you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.